The 3rd century AD, a period marked by rapid imperial turnover and civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic contraction, monetary instability, and disease. There was also a split of the empire into 3 entities: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and the Central Roman State. And we've seen over the last few episodes the story of Diocletian, a soldier who became emperor, ascended to power, and instituted through command and force a series of transformative reforms that restored stability. The most important of these reforms was the Tetrarchy, which was established in 293 AD, a system that divided power among 4 co-rulers, 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors. In this episode, we will talk about the fall of this system, which paved the way for the rise of a leader who would come to overshadow Diocletian, the Roman Emperor Constantine. His story begins with the end of Diocletian's story, so let's get into it on today's episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 83, The Fall of the Tetrarchy and the Rise of Constantine. Folks, before we get started, thanks for listening to the podcast. I encourage you to subscribe if you haven't already. Please also rate and review the podcast in whatever app you're listening to it. Lastly, I'll just mention you're free to donate to the Pax Romana podcast. There is a link to do so in the show notes page. All right, let's get to today's episode. As I mentioned in the introduction, the Tetrarchy was a system designed to restore order after 50-plus years of civil war, foreign war, and various other kinds of instability during what many historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Diocletian's Tetrarchy was clever. It was a system in which 2 senior emperors, which were known as the Augusti, each man was called Augustus, and then 2 junior emperors called Caesars. And the idea here was a meritocratic system, where the Caesars were not necessarily related to the Augusti. And when the Augusti left government, the Caesars would then succeed them and appoint, again by merit, their successors. And this was a system that marked a pretty significant departure from traditional dynastic rule. It had some elements of the old system during the Pax Romana, namely the idea of adoption. But at the same time, it partitioned out the empire into 4 distinct areas. That didn't mean that emperors couldn't cross over and help each other out, but it was a kind of collegial system designed to deal with the empire in the state of emergency that it was in the late 3rd century. As I mentioned before, despite this nominal unity, which was reinforced with appeals to traditional Roman religion, I talked about that on episode 81, there were some divisions within the Tetrarchy. A major source of these divisions was religion. Diocletian was a traditionalist. We see this in his adoption of Jupiter, the chief Roman deity, as his patron god. And this contrasts with somebody like Aurelian, who embraced the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. And Aurelian expected everyone in the empire to worship this one deity. Diocletian, however, did not want a single god to rule the Roman Empire. He believed in the old religious pluralism. He was one of many Roman elites who believed that the turmoil of recent decades was a direct result of novel religion. So it shouldn't surprise us that in February of 303 AD, Diocletian launched a great persecution of Christians in his home capital of Nicomedia. And I don't know the extent to which this persecution was a shock to Christians. On the one hand, they had experienced severe persecution under the Emperor Valerian in 260 AD, and we talked about that persecution in episode 76. But after Valerian was kidnapped and never seen again by any Roman, his persecution died down, and there was a period of relative peace that allowed Christians to reintegrate into Roman society. Christians joined the army in droves. They found their way into the imperial court. There were many elites, some senators even, that would have subscribed to Christianity. The prosperity of the church during this 50-year period eventually caught the attention of Diocletian. Christians, as you know, did not conform to the most elemental parts of Roman religion. And so Diocletian inaugurated this persecution. The actual edict he issued doesn't survive, but we have Lactantius and Eusebius both describing what, in essence, the edicts required. So this is, for example, Lactantius, quote, "In the 8th consulship of Diocletian and the 7th of Maximian, the prefect, together with the chief commanders, tribunes, and officers of the treasury, came to the church in Nicomedia, and the gates having been forced open, they searched everywhere for an image of the divinity. The books of the Holy Scriptures were found, and they were committed to the flames. The utensils and furniture of the church were abandoned to pillage. All was rapine, confusion, tumult." That's Lactantius in his On the Deaths of the Persecutors. So Lactantius describes what is effectively a raid on the church in Nicomedia, where Diocletian's soldiers burned scriptures and looted the building of all that was valuable. Eusebius, who wrote a history of the church, writes something very similar. He says, quote, "Royal edicts were published everywhere commanding that the churches be leveled to the ground and the scriptures be destroyed by fire, and ordering that those who held places of honor be degraded, and that the household servants, if they persisted in the profession of Christianity, be deprived of freedom." That's Eusebius's church history. So we have a specific example of what happened in Nicomedia, and also a sense of general persecution in other parts of the empire as well. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned, and there were loss of basic privileges for Christians. It's undoubtable that enforcement of these edicts varied across the empire. It was rigorous in the east under Diocletian and his Caesar Galerius, but it was much more lenient in the west under Constantius. And this lack of persecution of Christianity, or at least lack of enforcement of Diocletian's edict, would be a significant factor in bringing the Tetrarchy down, while also providing Constantine with his opportunity. So, by 304 AD, just a year after the persecution began, Diocletian ramped up his persecution, demanding universal sacrifice to Roman gods, culminating in an intensified campaign aimed at eradicating Christianity entirely. The problem, though, is what we see in Lactantius's commentary, where chief commanders, tribunes, and officers of the treasury, that is, imperial officials, were in charge of enforcing edicts, not necessarily the military. There was only so much officials could do to capture Christians, burn churches, and eradicate the scriptures. And then in Western provinces, there was even less done to the church. So this was a serious persecution, but it was not uniform. By 305 AD, we get a major political change that had influence on both the persecution of Christians as well as the Tetrarchy itself. Diocletian, by 305, had been in power for 20 years. This he deemed a long enough time to establish his system and give it its final test. Could the system sustain itself without Diocletian? And so Diocletian and his co-Augustus Maximian both abdicated in 305. They swore an oath to retire together, and they fulfilled that oath in 305, all of this reflecting Diocletian's commitment to a structured succession. Maximian, however, probably was not enthusiastic about abdicating, and we see evidence of this later. But at least initially, the process worked. So on May 1st of the year 305, there was a ceremony in Nicomedia where Diocletian addressed his troops, stepped down, and transferred power to his Caesar Galerius. Maximian in Milan did exactly the same thing, again to project unity, and he appointed his Caesar, Constantius, to Augustus. And then those two men, Galerius and Constantius, each elevated new Caesars. Maximinus Daza in the east, and Valerius Severus in the west. We have one of the few times in Roman history where there was a voluntary relinquishing of power, and a relinquishing of power when sons existed who could have taken power. So Maximian had a son named Maxentius who was passed over, and Constantius had a son named Constantine who was also passed over. But despite the ceremonies, the pretense of unity, and Diocletian's 20 years of rule and his insistence on establishing the Tetrarchy as a model for the future, the succession plan began to unravel within just a few months. By July of the next year, 306 AD, Constantius was dead while he was campaigning in Britain. With the death of an Augustus, his Caesar should take over. But Britain was a long way from Trier or Milan, and so the troops there in Britain proclaimed Constantius's son, Constantine, Augustus in the city of York, bypassing the Caesar Severus, bypassing even the idea of making Constantine Caesar. The army simply just declared him Augustus. This kind of military acclamation was common in the crisis of the 3rd century, and it seemed as though the merit-based framework that Diocletian had envisioned was just not as compelling as straightforward, dynastic military claims to the imperial throne. Funnily enough, during the same year, Maxentius, who was Maximian's passed-over son, decided to take control of Rome in a coup, declaring himself emperor with the support of the Praetorian Guard. So there were two direct challenges to the Tetrarchic system within a year or so of Diocletian and Maximian setting the system free. Who was going to restore the system? Well, that lot fell to Galerius. His claim to being Augustus remained unchallenged. He was in the east, in a more stable part of the empire, and he decided to work out a compromise. Constantius's true Caesar, Valerius Severus, well, Galerius made him Augustus as he was supposed to be. But Galerius did not let Severus appoint his own Caesar. Instead, Constantine was made Caesar. And the idea here was preserving the hierarchy of the Tetrarchy. We don't know if Maxentius was offered a similar compromise. Either way, he rejected the idea of being a Caesar. And so in 307, Severus marched his soldiers on the capital of Rome, quell Maxentius's rebellion. But he lost that battle and was captured and then killed. At this point, Maxentius was in clear rebellion. Constantine had been legitimized, and somebody needed to do something about this guy. The problem was that Maximian had clout and legitimacy because he was the son of Diocletian's Augustus. His father helped found the Tetrarchy itself. Was he really a rebel? And by the way, his father thought that his son should be one of the emperors, and he made a forceful argument for this by coming out of retirement as Augustus. So now, one of the old Augusti, who had previously abdicated, now returned to power. There are 6 Roman emperors when there were supposed to be 4. One of the legitimate ones was already dead. So we have a fatal flaw in Diocletian's merit-based succession system. The fact is, it could not withstand the pull of dynastic loyalty and military power. Finally, in addition to his father, Maxentius received help from a very unexpected source. In 307 AD, Constantine and Maximian forged a family alliance. Constantine married Maximian's daughter Fausta, becoming Maxentius's brother-in-law, but their alliance only lasted a couple of years, and Maximian and Constantine would soon come into open conflict. There is a direct connection between these changing alliances and the breakdown of the Tetrarchy and the religious situation as well. The Great Persecution was technically still ongoing, but in the part of the empire where Constantine resided and where his troops resided, that is, the northwest, especially parts of Great Britain and Gaul, Christianity continued to thrive. And Constantine, it seems, had some sympathy for this religion. He also had sympathies for sun worship. In other words, Constantine was a religious progressive, unlike Diocletian. He was happy to embrace or at least tolerate new religions, no doubt in part for pragmatic reasons. Many of his soldiers were likely Christians or sun worshippers. Meanwhile, in Diocletian's old capital of Nicomedia, Galerius issued an edict ending the great persecution began nearly a decade prior. In 311 AD, we get what is called the Edict of Toleration, which marks an official end to the persecutions. Both Lactantius and Eusebius talk about this edict, which says the following, quote, "We saw that the Christians were neither paying worship and reverence to the gods, nor worshiping the God of the Christians. We have thought fit in this case, too, to extend immediate indulgence, that they may be Christians once more and reconstitute their places of assembly on condition that they do nothing contrary to public order. They are bound to implore their own God for our safety, for that of the state, and for their own, so that on every side the state may be rendered secure." What we see in this edict, in addition to an end to persecution, is a kind of officialization, or at least official approval of Christianity, giving it the status of legitimate religion. There are provisions in here that make Christianity very similar to Judaism, for example, allowing Christians to worship and assemble so long as they petition their God on behalf of the emperors and the Roman state. The idea here is a very Roman one. We don't know the exact details of the gods, but it's probably a bad thing if some of them aren't being worshipped. At this point, Christianity was not an old religion, but it had endured for several centuries, giving it, in Roman eyes, some legitimacy. If Christianity was a completely illicit religion, it should have been destroyed by now. The fact that it endured suggests that at least something about it must be working, and so it makes sense to tolerate it at the very least, and that was probably Galerius's logic here. Meanwhile, in the West, Maximian had recently committed suicide, and Maxentius ruled Rome alone. Tensions between Constantine and Maxentius reached a climax in 312 AD. Constantine drew upon symbols of new religions. Constantine saw his once ally, now competitor, as vulnerable. So in the spring of that year, 312, Constantine crossed the Alps with a small, agile force, defeating Maxentius' soldiers in several battles as he moved through northern Italy. Advancing on Rome, he finally camped near the Milvian Bridge just outside the city. Right before the battle, Constantine supposedly experienced a dream, instructing him to mark his soldiers' shields with the symbol of the Chi Rho, a Christian monogram. Maxentius, however, received an oracle suggesting he confront Constantine directly. Two religious visions, two men competing for control of Rome, and maybe eventually the entire Roman Empire. Who would win this conflict? And what would happen to Christianity in an empire that now tolerated it and with a potential champion in the emperor himself? We will talk about the ongoing fortunes of the Tetrarchy, Christianity, and Constantine in the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.